There is an audio recording 17 minutes long that has circulated in fragmentary form since the early 1990s. The voice, distant and filtered through poor recording equipment, claims to belong to Rear Admiral Richard Byrd of the United States Navy. The interviewer speaks Spanish with a Chilean accent. The interview was broadcast once, on March 9, 1953, on a radio station in Santiago, Chile. The station went off the air permanently the following morning. The broadcast license was revoked by the Chilean government within 72 hours. The official explanation was regulatory violations. No details. The equipment was confiscated. The owner disappeared from public record. This is what Chilean telecommunications archives show, a transmitter with an 11-month broadcast history. Then nothing. If the interview was unremarkable, why shut down the station? Why confiscate equipment? Why remove the owner from public record? The content is the answer. In the recording, the voice describes flying 2,700 miles beyond the South Pole during Operation Highjump in 1947. Beyond it, into territory that should not exist because Antarctica ends well before that distance in any direction. The voice describes land that was green, vegetation, forests, flowing rivers, temperatures incompatible with the latitude, a landmass roughly the size of the United States, hidden behind Antarctic ice shelves absent from every official chart. Then the voice says something more specific. The land contains resources, mineral deposits, strategic materials critical to national security. Agreements were being negotiated among nations conducting Antarctic expeditions to manage access, but the public would not be informed because the geopolitical implications were too destabilizing during the early Cold War. The interviewer asks if this is being kept secret. The voice says the land's existence is known to governments conducting Antarctic operations, but there is no consensus on classification or legal framework. There are competing claims. The situation is delicate. Then the broadcast ends. The next morning, the station is dark. The Antarctic Treaty was signed in 1959, 6 years later. 44 countries are now parties to it. The treaty does something unprecedented. It freezes all territorial claims in Antarctica. Not settles them, freezes them. Britain, Norway, France, Argentina, Chile, Australia, New Zealand all agreed to suspend enforcement indefinitely. The treaty prohibits military activity, nuclear testing, and mineral extraction, without establishing who owns the territory. No other continent is governed this way, negotiated and ratified in 6 years. The law of the sea treaty took decades. The Antarctic Treaty achieved universal compliance immediately. The speed is the tell. You do not freeze territorial claims that fast unless the alternative is worse. You do not get imperial powers to abandon claims to an entire continent in 6 years unless traditional territorial competition is impossible. The revisionist answer, speculative but internally consistent, is discovery, not a frozen wasteland. Land and resources significant enough that open exploitation would destabilize the post-war geopolitical order being constructed in the 1950s. Operation Highjump was the largest Antarctic expedition ever mounted. 4,700 personnel, 13 ships, 23 aircraft, scheduled for 6 months, terminated after 8 weeks. Official reason, early Antarctic winter, but personnel evacuated in late February 1947, which is late summer. Winter onset is April or May, ships recalled, aircraft grounded. Byrd returned to Washington and gave a classified Defense Department briefing that has never been fully declassified. Portions released in the 1990s are heavily redacted. Remaining sections discuss logistics and equipment. Redacted sections pertain to geographical findings and strategic assessments. Why redact Antarctic geography 70 years later? We have operational records, ship manifests, supply logs. What we do not have is a complete account of where those ships went, what was found, what conclusions were drawn. Byrd's public statements after Operation Highjump are themselves anomalous. In an interview with El Mercurio newspaper in Santiago on March 5, 1947, Byrd said the United States should mount expeditions to both poles because in the event of a new war, The country could be attacked by fighters able to fly from pole to pole at incredible speeds. This was quoted at the time and then became strangely absent from later biographical accounts. Contemporary journalists treated it as metaphorical or delusional. Admiral Byrd discussing enemy aircraft staging from Antarctica was not taken seriously because there were no bases there, no runways, no infrastructure. But he did not say bases, he said the poles. And he said it in March 1947, months before the Cold War's most intense phase, before intercontinental ballistic missiles, before the strategic bomber fleets that would later make such concerns plausible. He was describing a threat from the south that did not fit any known geopolitical framework. The El Mercurio interview happened. It was published. The quotes are verifiable. What happened after is more interesting. Later accounts of Byrd's career, including his official Navy biography, either omit the El Mercurio interview entirely or reframe it as speculation about future technology. But the original text is descriptive. He describes based on what he saw, not what he imagined. Then, 6 years later, the Chilean radio interview. The voice describes land beyond the ice, resources, negotiations. If the interview is genuine, what he describes aligns precisely with what would explain the urgency of Antarctic Treaty negotiations that began in 1957. A continent-sized landmass with exploitable resources whose existence would create competitive territorial claims that the post-World War II order could not absorb without fracturing alliances being built to contain Soviet expansion. The solution would be to freeze all claims, prohibit extraction, and classify the findings. This is realpolitik. The history of empires is resource competition managed through legal frameworks that disguise or defer conflict. The Antarctic Treaty is an unusually explicit example. It does not resolve who owns Antarctica. It delays the question indefinitely. And you delay a question indefinitely because answering it now would cause problems larger than the uncertainty. The economic dimension is where this moves from historical curiosity to revisionist argument. Antarctica contains resources, mineral deposits, fresh water locked in glaciers, potential oil reserves. But consider what else might be there if Byrd's account is accurate. A landmass the size of the United States with habitable temperatures means arable land, strategic minerals concentrated in temperate zones, potentially rare earth elements critical to modern electronics and military technology. In 1953, the Cold War was accelerating. Both superpowers were desperate for uranium, titanium, chromium, materials essential for nuclear programs and jet aircraft. A hidden continent with accessible deposits would be worth more than all of Africa's colonial holdings combined. The Antarctic Treaty prohibits extraction of all of these, not because extraction is technically impossible, but because the treaty signatories agreed in 1959 that resource competition in Antarctica was too dangerous to allow. Too dangerous for whom? For the great powers. The treaty protects them from each other by ensuring no one can gain advantage, but it also protects them from accountability to their populations. If the resources exist and extraction is prohibited, then questions arise about what else might be managed through similar opaque agreements. The Chilean radio station that broadcast the Byrd interview was shut down the night the interview aired. The speed is inconsistent with bureaucratic enforcement. Regulatory violations generate warnings, fines, hearings, not immediate license revocations and equipment confiscations unless the state has compelling interest in stopping the broadcast immediately. What compelling interest would Chile have had in stopping a radio interview with a retired American admiral? Chile had active territorial claims in Antarctica in 1953. Those claims overlapped with British and Argentine claims. Anything that destabilized the fragile status quo would be diplomatically problematic. An American admiral discussing undisclosed land masses and resource deposits in territories that Chile, Britain, and Argentina were all claiming would create immediate pressure on the Chilean government to either confirm or deny the claims. Either answer would be diplomatically catastrophic. So the broadcast stops, the station goes dark. The problem is contained. This is the architecture of managed information, a structural tendency built into the diplomacy of contested territories to eliminate public discussion of facts that complicate negotiations happening behind closed doors. The Antarctic Treaty negotiations that began in 1957 were secret. The existence of negotiations was public, but the substance was not. Delegations met in closed sessions. The final treaty was presented as fait accompli. This is unusual. Treaty negotiations typically involve public comment, stakeholder input, press coverage. The Antarctic Treaty had none of that. Why negotiate in private? Technical complexity does not usually require secrecy. Political sensitivity does. And the specific sensitivity here, if the revisionist reading is correct, is that public knowledge of what exists in Antarctica would create popular pressure for access, for exploitation, for national advantage. Pressure the treaty is designed to prevent. The treaty does not say there are no resources. It says extraction is prohibited. The distinction matters. You do not prohibit extraction of something that is not there. The recording of the 1953 interview exists in fragments. The full 17 minutes has never been publicly released in verified form. What circulates are clips, segments, uploaded to internet archives without clear provenance. Audio forensic analysis conducted by independent researchers suggests the voice patterns are consistent with verified recordings of Byrd from the same period. But consistency is not proof. The recording could be genuine, fabricated, or partially edited. What is not in dispute is that the Chilean radio station existed, broadcast for 11 months, and then ceased operations abruptly, with its license revoked. Chilean telecommunications records confirm this. What is also not in dispute is that Admiral Byrd was in South America in early 1953. Navy travel logs place him in Buenos Aires in late February and early March. Santiago is 600 miles from Buenos Aires. Whether he went there, whether he gave an interview, these are open questions. But the timeline makes it plausible. What we have is a pattern. Operation Highjump terminated early. Classified briefings with redacted geographical findings. Public statements by Byrd describing strategic threats from the poles. A radio interview allegedly describing land beyond the ice. A radio station shut down immediately after broadcast. Then, 4 years later, an unprecedented treaty freezing territorial claims and prohibiting resource extraction, negotiated in secret and ratified universally in record time. Each piece individually can be explained as coincidence or standard diplomatic practice. Taken together, they form a structure. The structure suggests something was found in Antarctica between 1946 and 1959, significant enough to require international management and public silence. The stumps are still there, not literal stumps, documentary stumps, the redacted briefings, the missing context around treaty negotiations, the conspicuous absence of systematic geological surveys of Antarctica conducted before the treaty was signed. We have surveys after, conducted under the treaty's research provisions, but comprehensive pre-treaty surveys that would establish baseline resource assessments, those are absent. The most parsimonious explanation for the pattern is not that Antarctica is empty and the treaty is precautionary. The most parsimonious explanation is that something was found, assessed, and determined to be too valuable and too contested to allow competitive exploitation. So the solution was prohibition disguised as environmental protection and scientific cooperation. The Antarctic Treaty is often held up as a model of international cooperation, a triumph of science over politics, and in some ways it is those things. But it is also potentially one of the most successful examples of resource lockdown in modern history. An entire continent placed under legal quarantine, not to protect the environment, though that is the public rationale, to protect the great powers from the consequences of competing for what is underneath the ice. The interview that aired once on Chilean radio is part of this pattern. a fragment of the public record that did not survive long enough to become part of official history. And the reason it did not survive, the reason the station was shut down, is structurally identical to the reason the comprehensive geographical surveys are classified and the treaty negotiations were secret. Some information complicates the story that power needs to tell about itself. And when information becomes that kind of complication, it stops being public information. The recording may or may not be genuine, but the shutdown was real. The treaty was real. The redactions are real. And the pattern is consistent enough that dismissing it as coincidence requires ignoring the specific shape of what is missing. If you found this useful, share it with someone who notices when official stories have gaps too clean to be accidents, because that is how this kind of analysis moves, not through institutions that have incentives to maintain the official narrative, but through people who cannot stop asking what would need to be true for the evidence to look the way it looks. Stay curious, stay skeptical, stay informed,